Mrspeakers Ether 2. A big thank you to the folks over at headphones.com, and as usual you can find my written comments over there in the community section as well. I need to provide a little disclaimer here and say that this unit that I'm reviewing right now is not the original unit that I had received for review. This was a unit that Mrspeakers kindly sent to replace that unit because it was my feeling, after both listening to it for a long period of time and measuring it, that the initial unit that I received was not representative of the final product, or at least it wasn't representative of how this headphone would be for the majority of people who purchased it. And so I have to be very careful with my words here because I don't want to skew your opinion one way or another if I am critical about this. But I feel like I have to also just say everything that's on my mind when it comes to this headphone and put all of my thoughts out there. And hopefully this is just information for you to digest and it doesn't make you decide one way or another. I know that I have a small channel here, but it does influence people, I feel like, when it comes to more niche items like the Ether 2. So just make sure that if you are on the fence about this headphone, that know that my words here are not definitive and that there is a lot more information and a lot more still to come when it comes to the Ether 2. So let's jump right into the review. This on paper should be my perfect headphone, and I know that there's no such thing as a perfect headphone, and it's not my perfect headphone. It may be perfect for somebody, but it has a few major deal breakers for me, and I'll explain what that is. But to begin with, the design of this is spectacular. It's almost as if they've looked at all the negative things that I've said about top-of-the-line endgame high-end headphones in the past, about them being too bulky and uncomfortable to wear, and then addressed specifically that issue and massively reducing the footprint overall of the headphones. So they're extremely light. This, I believe, weighs under 300 grams. It weighs similar to the Aeon, which is it feels like it's about the same footprint, even though the Aeon's a smaller headphone. It feels thinner than the Aeon, which is also remarkable. And I think this is actually a 71mm or 70mm driver, planar magnetic driver in here, which is crazy to think about. So the fact that they were able to get all of that technology into something this small, especially when you compare it to something like the Odyssey LCD3 or the LCDX or whatever, and those are bricks compared to this. This is remarkably light and comfortable. This strap is a bit rough looking, kind of how it is on the Aeon as well, so it doesn't look quite as spectacular, but they've even perforated or put fairly large holes in here to make it a little bit more breathable and comfortable on the top of your head. So the design here is incredible, and I would go as far as to say that this is the thing that Mrspeakers does better than anybody else right now. In terms of design innovations, Mrspeakers is the king. However, there is one piece of this design that is a complete deal breaker for me. It might not be a deal breaker for you, and it's possibly that this was just overlooked and not taken into consideration, and I actually think they're going to fix this, but this is the first major deal breaker for me or somebody like me. It's the size of this ear hole for the pads. It's also almost perfectly ear-shaped. And what this does is it creates a seal on the side of your head. Now, if you've ever heard the term planar crinkle, you know what I'm about to say and how annoying that can be. But because this creates a seal, any pressure changes or inconsistencies can cause this planar crinkle effect to occur. And with me, I happen to have a beard and sideburns. It's not a particularly big beard, it's just that I have a little bit of facial hair, and that causes inconsistencies with the pressure. It took me a while to figure out what was going on here and why this planar crinkle was so bad. And I actually thought that the original unit that I had was broken because it was that bad. And then, of course, I received this new unit from them, and nope, sure enough, it does it as well. It's as if somebody is taking cellophane paper and just kind of crinkling it next to your ears. And it's so bad on this that even if I move my head from left to right, it causes this effect to occur. Now, some people have reported that they only experience this when you push on the sides. I definitely hear that as well. But for somebody like me who has a bit of facial hair, that causes this pressure inconsistency that makes that crinkle effect either more pronounced or occur more easily. So it makes it more sensitive to the crinkle effect. And so personally, that makes it completely unusable for me. Now, I have had people who don't have beards use this, and the response I got was that they don't have this issue. And I've also tried it while I was wearing sunglasses, just because I wanted to see what it would be like for somebody wearing glasses, and it made it so that it was a lot less annoying. It was still there, but it helped quite a bit. So I like to joke that I have audiophile sunglasses. But nonetheless, that kind of indicated to me that that was what's going on. And it took me forever to figure out why this effect has been occurring, and I'm pretty sure that it's because of the facial hair. And it could also be to do with the head shape and the ear shape and earlobes and all this other stuff. But the fact that it exists at all is completely not okay. It's to the point where if I were to buy this and I had that experience, I would immediately return it because it's just not usable. Now, Mr. Speakers may already be aware of this, and this may be one of the reasons why they're also releasing additional pads. I know that they have a pad with a larger ear cutout in the works or about to release, and probably by the time you're watching this already released. So that may alleviate that issue. If you're considering the Ether 2 and you have facial hair of any sort, I would email them and ask them about this because it's such a massive deal breaker for me that I can't overstate this enough. If you don't have facial hair or you have average or smaller ears, this probably won't be an issue. Just keep that in mind if you do. With both Mr. Speakers and ZMF, the original T50RP modders that have now turned into headphone companies, they are always experimenting and innovating and building new pads to sell that will work with their products. So that's something to keep in mind. I mean, these are passionate headphone enthusiasts like the rest of us, if not more so. So I would look to them to be fixing that issue here. Now, let's get to the sound. The detail retrieval capabilities with Ether 2 are quite good. It's an upgrade over the Aeon Flow Open, and it's an upgrade over many of those sort of kilobuck headphones, probably around the same as the LCD-X, although it's been some time since I've heard that one, so I can't fully comment on that. The transient speed didn't stand out on the Ether 2 as much as it did on some other planers that I've heard recently. It's still good. It's still a planer, very fast, but I don't think it's the highlight in terms of its performance qualities. I actually think that ends up being the soundstage. It's a very wide and open sounding headphone, and the imaging is also spectacular. And that's, again, my definition of imaging, which isn't just positional accuracy, it's structural definition for the images and how well they're defined they are. And to me, that's a good indicator for detail as well. So those two in my mind are linked. And that's also why I think the detail retrieval capabilities of the Ether 2 are quite good, and in my mind, about on par with that of the Focal Clear and LCD-X. I don't think it quite matches that of the Verite. The Verite, if I compare the two, I was originally going to do a video on a comparison between the Verite and the Ether 2, but I don't think that it's fair. The Verite, it does better in the detail department than the Ether 2. Not by a lot, but it's noticeable. And then, of course, you get the planar timbre, which, again, because of the tonality, isn't as pronounced here. And so while this performs quite well, it's a very tight and punchy and well-controlled headphone. It doesn't quite do as well as the Verite, and it doesn't have the same kind of dynamic slam. I don't know how else to characterize that quality of just hitting hard. Even though it has a very linear response in the bass, which is a good thing, it doesn't hit as hard. It still hits with ample authority, and I wouldn't really say that's a downside, but compared to, again, some of the Odyssey stuff, for example, those hit harder. So let's jump into the tonality. The Ether 2's tonality is the other reason why I initially contacted Mrspeakers with the assumption that the unit that I was evaluating was not representative of the final product and what people are going to get if they buy this. Because the original unit sounded quite dark. Darker than my expectations, considerably darker than my expectations, after having looked at a bunch of different measurements for this headphone. After doing a bit of digging, it turns out that there is quite a bit of variation in terms of tonality on a unit-to-unit basis, or at least the earlier units don't sound quite the same as the current production units. At least that's my suspicion. Here's where I need to stress that a lot of this is still being figured out, and my words here are not definitive. But my experience has been that the initial unit was extremely dark, and the measurements indicate this as well. Darker than a 650. And then the new unit, the replacement unit, measures quite a bit brighter than that. Still warm, but not on the same level of it being a little bit muffled sounding. So this unit in particular has a much better tonality through the treble, where it's not just a piece of information missing like it was on the other unit. But again, I have to stress, don't take this as the definitive statement when it comes to this headphone, because these are things that I can't possibly know. I'd like to think that they've got this stuff figured out and that the production units are quite a bit more consistent with each other. I should also mention that planar magnetic headphones, especially higher end planar magnetic headphones, have a history of having a bit of variation as well. So for example, the Odyssey stuff used to be notorious for that. So I don't think this is outside of the realm of expectation, but keep that in mind that if you buy one of these and it shows up super dark, they don't all sound like that, because the replacement unit doesn't. So getting into the tonality here, it has an extremely linear bass, which is wonderful. There's no bump or elevation, there's no roll off. This is just all the way down, and I have no complaints with the bass. The mid-range, according to the HEQ compensation, which again, take with a huge grain of salt, this is not industry standard by any means, shows that there's a slight elevation to the mid-range, but it doesn't really sound too much like that. But it does sound quite thick and rich tonally. I don't know if that's to do with the slight dip and cut in the treble that even this new unit does exhibit, causing it to be a little bit warmer sounding. It's probably the case, and I think that the new pads that get released will likely improve that sort of openness or airy quality, which is already reasonable. If you're looking for something that's not quite as warm, wait until the new pads come out and then see what people are saying. But nonetheless, the transition into the treble is also excellent. It's very linear all the way until around the 4K-ish region, and here is again where the HEQ compensation just goes all over the place, at least in my opinion. And while I can't completely trust it, I can still say that there is a bit of this unevenness here. Thankfully, there is this elevation again at around 8K, and that brings some of that sparkle back. But to be sure, this is a more romantic sounding headphone that has that kind of warmth that again the HE650 has as well. It's been said about countless headphones before, and I think this is going for a similar thing. I'd said in the opening of this review that it's almost as if Mrspeakers looked at every single criticism I had of top of the line headphones, be they too bright or too heavy or uncomfortable, and then fixed all of those issues. And like I said, this is probably the perfect headphone for me on paper, because they prioritized the things that we should be looking at when it comes to high-end headphones: comfort and wearability, usability. With a tonality, that's no exception. This is that laid-back, romantic, and unfatiguing, non-fatiguing experience that you can listen to and have on your head for the majority of the day, and it won't be tiresome at all. And that's a great quality to have. But personally, I still wish that there was more presence in the treble, and I wish, especially after listening to some of the Hi-Fi Man planar magnetics, where there's a bit more of this sort of sparkle up top, and the treble is done really, really well. I wish that this had that. Now, again, I think those other pads are going to help with this a little bit. When I look at this tuning and when I hear it as well, even with this new version, to me it feels as if there's a tendency to want to reduce the treble rather than risk it being too sharp. And that's the right course of action, but it's not the best. Because if treble is tuned correctly, like some of the Hi-Fi Man stuff's been doing, and even some of the Focal stuff in my opinion, it doesn't need to be reduced or subdued. It can remain at a relatively neutral volume, and that's not a problem. It's only when things get over sharpened or grainy or have a sibilance peak that you want to just crank down the treble. And while the Ether 2's treble is the lesser of two evils, it's still not the absolute best or final statement in terms of what treble should be. And so again, I'm hopeful that these new pads that get released increase some of the energy there, but even without that lift, it's still fairly easy to EQ. You can just bump that up with a fairly wide Q value and you'll be fine. You don't need to worry about the slight dip that happens sort of around 3.5K or wherever it happens on your unit. Ultimately, that is the issue with the tonality. It's that because of this unit variation, you don't really know where to EQ it because your unit may not be what the measurements for other people are showing. And because this is actually a new unit, I would expect and hope that any new units that are out now are fairly close in terms of tonality to this. And I get that frequency response is not the final statement on headphones, and what I'm doing here is not to be taken as objective in any way. This is just so that I have some reference point for my evaluation. So in conclusion, let's keep in mind that this headphone costs $2,000. And while it's not on the same level of detail retrieval capabilities as the Utopia or the Verite or the HD800S even, it's about on par with the Focal Clear and the LCD-X, at least from memory for the LCD-X. And so that makes this more expensive than its competitors, at least as far as detail retrieval is concerned. The reason that you buy the Ether 2 isn't because it outclasses those other headphones in performance. It's because it does as good, and in some categories it does better. For example, the soundstage here is very spacious and the imaging is superb. So the reason that you buy this is because of how incredibly good the design is, because of how light and small and nimble this is. This, again, should have been the perfect headphone on paper, and for some people it might be. There's that major deal breaker that I talked about that makes it completely unusable for me, but is likely to be fixed with new pads, and likely to not be an issue for many other people. And then there's the tonality, which is a little bit too warm for my taste, but some people may, again, be super into that. Beyond that, while Mrspeakers has a few things to iron out still with the Ether 2, as we start to push the limits for what's possible with sound from headphones, if that's even a thing, this is the direction that I'd like to see the design efforts going. Let's make headphones smaller, lighter, easier to wear, and retain the same sound quality that you get with these top-of-the-line massive headphones that this is such a nice departure from. So that does it for this review. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video, and I will see you guys in the next one.